edition of the LERA Competition Festival. In very short introductory remarks, I want to give you some information about the festival. Let me start with some numbers. We have more than 300 people that will attend the festival over these 4 days. They come from more than 30 countries, and we cover all the 5 continents, I have to say. So we are very proud for this success of our initiative. Yesterday we had, let's call the pre-festival, the open day at the poster session, which are meant to create a bridge between the professional organizations and the young talents that want to pursue a career in this field. Today the festival starts with many sessions. We have 23 partners that have actively contributed to the program of the festival, and we'll have 28 sessions that will take place over these 3 days. Now, the program is very rich, so let me tell you that we have developed an app that you can download from all the major gatekeepers. And in this app, you will find the program of the event. You will find the name of the speakers, a short description of the content of each session, a biography of each speaker, the list of all participants with their affiliations. So if you want, you can contact them during the festival or afterwards, and many other features. So please download the app. If you need any help, there would be the registration desk that will assist you. The program is rich. I won't summarize the topics that will be covered, but let me just mention a few sessions I'm particularly proud of. Today we will have the Young Talent Competition Awards ceremony, where, as you know, we award a prize to PhD students and young researchers for their research proposals. And we have a scientific committee formed by Pinar Ackman, Michele Carpagnano, Bill Kovacic, Joe Arrington, and Tommaso Valletti, and they've helped us in selecting 3 finalists that will present their projects, and then the winner will be announced. Tomorrow we have John Vickers that will deliver a keynote speech on how competition may be affected by an imperfect demand side of the market, and how this may affect the desirability of public intervention, including antitrust enforcement. Then we'll have Andrea Pratt and Tommaso Valletti. They will talk about the relationship between market power and political power, which is a very interesting and highly debated topic. And then we will have Diana Moss and Richard Wish that will summarize for us the latest enforcement activities in the US and the EU. It's very difficult to summarize 1 year of activity in half an hour, but we are in the good hands of Richard and Diana. And tomorrow there will be Friday, sorry, there will be the roundtable of the national competition authorities, and again with the help of Richard Wish, we will hear from the heads of national agencies about the recent activity, the new pieces of legislation that just entered into force, and their priorities for the future, for the near future. The last session I want to talk about is the one I'm going to leave the floor in a minute. This session is organized and managed by the Italian Antitrust Association. It has an outstanding panel of speakers, as you can see. But let me indulge in some personal memory and feelings by thanking 2 of them in particular, Giuliano Amato and Alberto Pera. Giuliano Amato needs no introduction, of course. He has held many crucial roles in public life in Italy and abroad. But for me, he's still the president of the Italian Competition Authority, because I was the former president, so to speak, because I was had the fortune of starting my career as a young official at the Autorità when Giuliano Amato was in that position. And in the same years, Alberto Pera was the Secretary General of the same institution. So I have to say that thanks to them, among others, being in that position, working in that institution at that time was a great experience for me. And so I take this opportunity to thank them. So without further ado, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This on? Yes. So thank you very much, Paolo. I thank you. I thank you, Leah. I want just to say one word about how good Paolo is. Do you? Yep. Yes. How good has been Paolo as an entrepreneur, not only as an economist, but as an entrepreneur, by starting as a public official, setting up a consultancy, very successful one, but not only that, organizing, it has been organizing the things for years, and it is becoming more and more important and relevant. So I thank you and I congratulate. I think it's also a good testimony of how revolving doors may be useful, by the way. The Italian Antitrust Association is the association of Italian law firms and economic consultancies operating in the field of competition, and it numbers more than 55 consultancies and law firms, and so about 600 associates or professionals working on the field. We have been organizing the opening session for a couple of years now, and we are very glad that Paolo invited us to do that. Last year we had Peppina Rachma, Alberto Toffoletto, Giorgio Monti, and Antonio Butta discussing the subject is the more economic approach in good health. According to some recent decision of the European Court of Justice, it is. According to instead what we hear from across the Atlantic, it is not. We will continue to monitor this. Today we tackle an even more lofty subject with an even more outstanding panel, and the effect of developments in state intervention, mainly related but not only to the growing role of industrial policies on the working of the market and competition, and the compatibility with EU general rules and construction. The reason for the development of industrial policy in Europe and elsewhere are well known: geopolitical developments, technological changes and the effect on traditional and new industries, keeping the pace with other economic areas in advanced sectors, worries about national security. However, the measures implemented also are implemented especially at state level, not only at state level, may impact on some of the tenets of the European Constitution, on the European construction, based on a competitive and integrated market system and a social market economy. Many years back, when Paolo was at the authority, possibly, Commissioner Van Miert asked about European industrial policy, argued that European industrial policy was competition. 20 and more, actually 30 years later, Benoît Cœuré, the head of the French Competition Authority, in a recent speech he gave in Rome, argued that the future of European economy in the next 10 years will be the ability to coordinate industrial policies and competition. Well, it is not an easy task to discuss these issues and put them in a correct perspective, but as we said, we have an outstanding panel. I don't think we could gather a better one. Giuliano Amato has already been introduced by Paolo. He has been the president of the Italian Constitutional Court, but he has had a number of other extremely important roles, and he has been the chairman of the Italian Antitrust Authority. He has taught competition law in New York at the European University Institute. So he's extremely, he has all the, I couldn't think of anybody who could be as prepared to discuss these issues as he is. He will introduce the discussion. Mario Siragusa, who needs no presentation either, because he is a star-rated competition lawyer in Europe and professor at Bruges and chairman of the Association of Italian Association of European Jurists, will then discuss particularly with a view to the European, to the compatibility of industrial policies with the European system. Finally, Stefano Firpo is an economist, which studied at the London School of Economics, and I say this because I did too 20 years earlier. Then he worked at the European Central Bank as an economist. He has taken a number of important positions in public administration. In particular, he has been Director General for Industrial Policy and Competitiveness at a point. He is now Director General of Assonime, the Association of Joint Stock Companies, so basically the large companies in Italy, which is an important center of debate on law economics for enterprises in the market. So I think we may have a very interesting discussion, and now I leave the floor to Giuliano.
Thank you, Alberto. Good morning to everybody. Well, these are really strange times. We should give a look at the entire horizon where we have a newly proactive antitrust on the one side and a newly proactive state intervention in fields that have nothing to do, unhappily, with antitrust. Last year I wrote a book, the title of which was Welcome Back State, But. Now, I am convinced of the reasons for the welcome, but the reasons for the but are growing and growing. I must say that somehow the same thing has happened with antitrust, because I could have written welcome back antitrust, but. So what is happening? On the one side, we have the US antitrust that is going back, as I used to say, to identifying private power as the target against which antitrust should exercise its role to preserve freedom on the markets vis-à-vis the power of the few. The big ones, the big tech, all of these things have somehow changed and, from our angle, made somehow more European the use of the antitrust tools. It is of a few days ago, the last intervention of the FTC against Amazon. For a clear, in Europe we would define it an abuse. They have other categories, it doesn't mean anything. What is important is that not only efficiency in terms of consumer welfare of the day after, not of the week after, is what they are taking care of. And this is something that goes toward sort of harmonization with the European view that has always been different and bolder. And bolder. All of us know, we are of the antitrust family, that in principle antitrust is about what has already happened, a violation, a fact that is there and that I have to remove. At the same time, when we were given the power to supervise mergers and acquisitions, somehow our horizon became different. Not the past, not facts already occurred, but the future, the structure of the market in the future. I must say, as a European, that the fact that the reaction of the Americans to our boldness in protecting the future structure of the market, they said, you remember in the famous General Electric Honeywell difference between us and them, their reaction to the European decision was, we are more humble than you Europeans in assessing the future. It was somehow surprising because we learned economic analysis from them. And we were not using astrology to look at the future, but economic analysis. They were somehow restraining themselves within limits that were much more restraining than what economic analysis could have suggested them to do. And they restrained their attention to consumer welfare in terms of prices of the day afterward, not of the following week. Now they have deeply changed. There is always somebody, a young lady, that wrote a famous new paradox, and now she is there bringing actions against Amazon and others, to the point that people like me says, this is fine, okay, here we are together again, but don't run beyond your limits. Because by using antitrust, you have the sense that frequently they want to do something that needs something else. The toolbox of antitrust was underused in the past. It cannot be used doing more than what can be done. They themselves have to accept what we in Europe are doing finely, I must say. On the one side, antitrust, on the other side, regulations. And you well know that all the area of private data, use of them, storing of them, sale of them, is something that is more appropriately dealt with by regulation than by using antitrust. So, welcome back antitrust, but don't do what is beyond your limits. This propensity to overdoing is also appearing on the other side, the side of the return of the state. I remember when I was heading the Italian Antitrust Authority, in one of my annual reports, I wrote that the best, and for the future perhaps the only industrial policy, will be antitrust, because you don't need anything more. If the market is competitive, innovation, efficiency, new products will arrive. Perhaps for a while this is what did happen, but we have to understand and we have to accept, and Schumpeter was the first one to teach us in these terms, that if more innovation is needed, is the technological cycle you had is over, not necessarily competing with each other by using the old technologies and without the necessary innovation is enough to produce innovation. So you have the disruptive part of the cycle, but not the other. The use of public resources can be essential for those medium and long-term investments that help private companies to introduce the necessary innovation. In these terms, one of the lessons of the so-called neoliberal years of the early 21st century, the lesson is, well, public resources for innovation can be extremely helpful. And here is where I arrive easily. But the facts of life, China, pandemics, and whatever, introduced a new principle. We have to produce on our own what we might need more in depending on the conditions, because the global market might somehow get fractured. A pandemic can be the reason for the fracture. A war can be the reason of the fracture. A conflict, security reasons. And therefore, a very dangerous principle was introduced, the principle of strategic autonomy. You can get excited, strategic autonomy, etc. I said I was joking, but while we were talking together, it reminds me of the Italian 30s of the last century, when a regime decided that we should have what in Italian was named autarchia, producing all what we needed on our own. The compatibility between strategic autonomy and its implications and the framework of a competitive market is really hard to find, because strategic autonomy implies that I produce whatever the cost, I produce independently of what the market could. Of course, if the market doesn't work, I have to find something. So perhaps this principle is unavoidable, but at the same time, the risks are enormous. The risks are enormous because it works in terms of state aids. Now, state aids, at least in Europe, there is quite a battery of principles that we apply due to a treaty that includes state aids among the limitations of the competitive market, and therefore under the heading of antitrust. Antitrust authorities have jurisdiction on state aids. It is not so in the States. It is not so. And it is something, I'd like to have Lina Khan here and say, how do you feel with the Inflation Reduction Act? Because you are flamboyant there, big tech, etc., etc. The administration arrives and by heavy state aids, given to whoever produces in the States, creates a sort of inadmissible distance between the reasons of competitiveness and the reasons of industrial policy. Can we do better in Europe? Here it's really open. Unhappily, the treaty has a gigantic loophole here when it says that if the aids correspond to an important European project, my God, nothing nowadays is more important than strategic autonomy, and therefore any state can provide its companies with aids based on an important European project. And here, let me also say something that has not been said for years. When I was young, and I was heading our authority, with my colleague of the Bundeskartellamt, we were trying to advocate the independence, also at the European level, of the antitrust authority, independence necessarily of the Commission. After a while, we had to give up. We had to give up because the reasons for independence were sound and credible, but the objection was it has been so difficult to create the necessary authority in this work of the Commission that creating a new authority and having it recognized all over Europe with the authority that is needed is too risky. It might take, we don't know how much time. The fact is that we gave up. But now, here we are. One of the main policies of the Commission is implementing strategic autonomy. Whether national policies and national decisions of state aid are adopted that are inconsistent with the principles of antitrust, but remain inside the framework of the industrial policies connected to strategic autonomy, the same Commission will decide. Now, our friends of DG4 might be heroes, but eventually the decision is of the same body. I can only say but I have no remedy. Clearly have no remedy. Could I say that therefore it would be better for us to have tomorrow a new and independent authority? Perhaps the old answer would apply again. They would tell me, yeah, it's nice, it's fine, but can you start it now? And therefore, we have this situation nowadays. Industrial policies are prevailing all over our Western market. In the States, there is no competence, no jurisdiction of the antitrust on these matters. You can't expect the DOJ to do something in this area. In Europe, something will be done. At least it would be better for us to have European funds for European aids, avoiding at least the fragmentation again of national markets, with each member state giving its own aids. At least, but this is very much difficult. This would imply a central fiscal capacity that does not exist and that is opposed by several member states. So this is a dream. This is a dream. And here we are, you see, in this contradictory world. On the one side, a renewed antitrust, going back to its origins, fighting private power as it had never done for years, against the big tech, etc., restoring also exploitative abuses that had remained quite at the margin for years. And at the same time, the states that are almost freely damaging the competitiveness of the market. So here we are. I have not touched, because I have no time, the golden power. But the golden power is the other side of this new intervention, not by aid, but by prescriptions, by ad hoc regulations, company by company. Security reasons. Security reasons exist. I can't deny that they are there. But at least a requirement which doesn't seem to be complied with, the statutes regulating this golden power should at least limit the discretionary decisions of those who have the use of this power. Honestly, something has been changing in Italy in these 10 years since the golden power was initially introduced. But even now, we are in the hands of those who decide case by case what has to be done and which prescriptions are needed. The word is bizarre. We have returned to the best of the possible antitrusts on the one side, and on the other side, we have the most efficient instruments to corrode the competitiveness of the market without the antitrust authorities. They can't do much in this area. So, you will decide whether you are lucky or not. Of course, for those who work in antitrust, there is a lot to be done. And professionally, these are not bad times. But if you care about the principles, the coherence of what happens, now I finish. When I began my analysis of antitrust several years ago, I said that it's a balance between too much of private power and too much of public power. And we should avoid both. We need both somehow, but we have to limit both. Now, perhaps we have too much of antitrust and too much of public power against it. Contradictory times. And there is nothing we can do. It's a new world in which conflicting principles, conflicting realities, conflicting trends occur. And there is nobody that can somehow create a sort of consistency and order. Let's hope that you, new generations, will have enough opportunities, enough authority to exercise, to restore some sort of order. But when you read that we live in a disorderly world, your field is one of the main examples of this disorder, and I leave it here.
Thank you very much, Giuliano, because you have been able to put together a number of issues that we've often seen from a very specific point of view, while they are very much interconnected. That was the meaning also of this session. One issue that now I leave the floor to Mario, although you have a lot of suggestions. Among the others, I would add that, and Giuliano added at the end, that not only you have European industrial policies, but you have state interventions as well, which appear to be justified by European regulations, like FDI regulation, but then at the end they end up to risking partitioning the European market, which should not be partitioned. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for this excellent presentation by our president. And I agree that we are in a world of contradictions and contrasting developments, but I am a little bit more optimistic because I think that whatever policies are decided, there are certain principles of the treaty that cannot be overcome by policy decisions. And I will try to explain why I think that, notwithstanding, I agree fully with the presentation which has been made, that there is a tendency, a dangerous tendency towards policies which may have effects negative with respect to competitive markets. Some principles of the treaty cannot be bypassed, even by the political decisions. Thanks in particular also to what I think is the genial invention of our treaty, which is the direct applicability of some of those principles. So let me go through what are the main tools, which I will first focus on state intervention, then if I have time I would also comment on the antitrust developments. But on state interventions, what are the major tools which are used in order for the state to act economically, and what are the tools which can be used also to affect negatively the market? I think it's basically the use of public undertakings, enterprises which are controlled by the state, by direct intervention with all sorts of measures which should be subject to the rules on state aids, and then of course regulations may also create, as you have just mentioned, problems with the market economy. But the treaty, of course, is neutral in Article 345 as to the system of property ownership. So, in principle, all those tools can be used and are used by the member states, but still they are subject to some very important principles and very important restrictions. Let's look a moment at the public undertakings. Public undertakings, of course, to the extent that their resources are controlled or are subject to decisive influence by the state authority, they are considered to be state resources, right? So that's very important. So the state aid rules will apply also to the decisions and investments made by state enterprises. And to the extent that the decisions can somehow be imputed to the public authorities, then of course that is a measure under the Stardust jurisprudence which can be considered to be state resources and decisions which can be attributed to the authorities of a member state, therefore which are subject to the rules of state aid. State aid would apply. Then of course we have the derogation under Article 182 for the undertaking entrusted with the operation of service of general economic interest. And I suppose that these may be used in this environment of today about autonomy, economic autonomy and strategic autonomy as a tool which can be used by entrusting companies with operations of service of general interest. Of course, member states can determine when an undertaking is, when a service is considered to be a service of general economic interest, subject to the control of the court in cases of manifest error. But the derogation is subject to close scrutiny under the state aid rules, and is subject to the Hallmark judgment. So you have to respect the 4 conditions of the Hallmark case. Which are those conditions? Of course, the recipient must have public service obligations which have to be clearly defined. The parameters on the basis of which the compensation is calculated must be established in advance in an objective and transparent way. The compensation cannot exceed what is necessary to cover all or part of the costs, and the undertaking, if the undertaking is not chosen through a public procurement procedure, then of course the level of compensation must be determined on the basis of the analysis of the costs of an undertaking which is well run and which has a proper means of production. So you have a framework which in any event, whenever there are intervention by the state granting compensation for specific tasks which are attributed to those enterprises, whatever is the characteristic of the enterprise, whether it's public or whether it's private, those rules must apply. And I think this is in the treaty, and this is the jurisprudence of the court, and whatever political choice is made, those rules have to be respected. State aid. Of course, the state can intervene even directly, not necessarily through a public undertakings. And there we know what are the conditions in order for a measure to be considered state aid. And of course, the most important of the conditions is that the measure should not give a selective advantage to the recipient of the aid, right? And again, the jurisprudence of the court has developed the market economic operator principle, so that the intervention has to be subject to close scrutiny in order to see whether or not this principle is respected. If the principle is respected, the measure is not considered state aid, but if it's not, then it's subject to the notification obligation and all the review by the Commission. And these apply broadly. These apply to investments made by public bodies, to debt renegotiation by public creditors, to sale of assets by public bodies, so to apply to a large variety of intervention of the state into the economy. If the principle of the market economy operator is not respected, then it is a measure of state aid which has to be subject to the rules of state aid, has to be submitted to the Commission, unless, of course, it falls into an exemption or it's a de minimis, but then has to be approved by the Commission. It's true that there has been a lessening of intensity of application of the state aid rules through the temporary framework because of the COVID, but I think we are going back to a regime, to the ordinary regime, and therefore those rules have to apply. It's true that it is the Commission which has to apply, so I can see very well what the President has said, that there may be a contradiction between a political choice and, on the other hand, the application of those principles, but fortunately many of those rules are direct applicable. So the private citizen in certain circumstances can act, and the national judge is the guardian of the treaty. So what we need is a very important and very careful application of the principle of the treaty through the involvement of interested parties, which can, of course, bring the case in front of the judiciary if there is a deviation, even by the Commission, of some of those rules. And finally, let me say a few words on intervention through regulation. Of course, this is one of the main tools which are used by states, and it's an intervention which may have a negative impact on the market economy. And the interesting example is certainly the control of foreign direct investment. It's a very important example of the danger of over-regulation and what are the tools that we have to resist such tendency. As you know, the Italian regime on the control of foreign direct investment is, in a sense, in implementation of the directives at EU level. The Italian regime contains a very broad definition of the sectors which are considered sensitive, which are subject, of course, to ex-ante control. From the subjective point of view, it is applicable in all sectors to all subjects, even if established in the EU, but which are ultimately controlled by an entity outside of the EU. So that applies to in all sectors. And in several sectors, not only defense, but also national security, not only defense and national security, but also communications, energy, transport, health, agro and food, financial. It is applicable, the rules, also to acquisitions of control by subjects which are in turn controlled by an entity within the EU. So this raises a clear problem on the freedom of establishment and the principles of the treaty. This has created this huge, amount of notifications. It's fantastic for lawyers. I think it's terrible for our economy. We lose a lot of time. It is really incredible. A machinery has been created which is typical of the danger of the bureaucracy of our administration. But fortunately, there is the Court of Justice. And there is a very recent decision, very important, of the Court of Justice, the Xella case, C-106-2022 of 13 July of 2022. It's a very, very important judgment. What was the issue there? The question related to a reference from Budapest Court to the Court of Justice. It has to do with the Hungarian system of control of foreign direct investment, which allows the competent ministry in Hungary to prevent foreign investors, including entities established in the EU but controlled by an entity outside of the EU, to acquire Hungarian companies. The Hungarian company involved in this case was a company which was involved in mining gravel, sand, and clay. So that doesn't look like a very sensitive area. The Court of Justice has held that the acquiring company cannot be considered a foreign investor within the meaning of the directive, and that preventing the acquisition would constitute a restriction on the freedom of established in violation of Article 49. The Court has added that such a restriction, of course, can be justified on grounds of public policy, public security, or public health, but those notions have to be interpreted narrowly. I think that on the basis of this case law, it is absolutely clear that our legislation is not in line with those principles. And I'm not only saying in the case of which the entity is established in a member state but is controlled by an entity outside of the member state. I can imagine that there can be some policy reasons, in particular if the entity controlled outside is Chinese or what have you. But that even it applies when an entity is subject to the control of another entity which is in another member state, there is, I think, absolutely no way to argue that the Italian legislation is in line with the treaty. So regulation has lots of dangers, but there are principles. There are principles which have to be applied, and it is our role as professionals in this area to make sure that the national institutions, the EU institutions, respect the treaty. It's up to us. So that's why I say it's not so bad, the situation. We have the tools, but the tools have to be used. And again, I repeat, many of these regulations these days are regulations which are at the European level. We have, of course, the examples of the Next Generation EU, where all those interventions are made through public funds which have EU origin, but still all the projects are subject, as the regulations on the Next Generation specifically indicates, to the application of the state aid rules. And as you know, in that program, there is the obligation for the member state to imply lots of reforms which go all through the opening of the markets and creating the more competitive markets. So we have the tools, we have to use them, and the most important tool is the direct applicability of those principles. It's up to us to defend the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. It's really, I mean, it's good that you recorded at the end the European construction sets rules and we must abide to them. From this point of view, I think that the Excel judgment is a very important judgment, which is probably not still being digested. But it has to. And this gives us a good introduction for Stefano Firpo introduction, for Stefano Firpo intervention, from, say, what you see from the point of view of the industry in a general sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I might appear here as a sort of an intruder and a paladin of industrial policy because of my background as Director General at the Ministry of Industry. But I heard what has been said, and probably my position will disappoint also those who are in favor of stronger industrial policy in Europe. Sorry. Because as I was a minority, a very small minority, when I was representing Italy in the Competition and Growth Council in the EU, when the EU was introducing pretty much unrealistic environmental regulation to promote decarbonization, punishing European industry, nowadays, I'm also very much a minority and a skeptical minority when I see equally unrealistic targets established by the EU on industrial policy to achieve strategic autonomy. I see we are kind of paralyzed between two unrealistic approaches by the European Union on these two fields. And now these two unrealistic approaches, quite paradoxically, are really bumping into each other and creating those contradictions. But let me go back and comment on a few important things which has been said today. One thing is about antitrust. I'm not an antitrust lawyer, so I would probably enter into a difficult field for me. But when I see antitrust regulation in the EU nowadays, I see it very much focused on the big tech. No? It's a sort of Shoshana Zuboff kind of stream. And we saw the Digital Market Act, which is introducing ex-ante regulation to lower the anti-competitive power of what is called gatekeepers. We saw the Digital Service Act, which is also introducing important limits on, for example, profiling. So there is a very strong attitude against basically the platform economy, with, as I told you, a sort of ex-ante intervention on these operators. And it's very much resembling somehow what has been done on privacy, on the GDPR. And I always wonder how binding and really effective this regulation is going to be. Is it really able to stifle anti-competition behavior from those platforms, or will simply just stifle innovation? This is a quick question, because when at the end of the day, you see, you analyze the tools which are within this regulation, at the end of the day, they are very much formalistic and bureaucratic. And I can easily see that this platform will find an easy way, and lots of loopholes, to create lots of formalistic compliance, but at the end, they will remain fully in power of what they're doing. So I have doubts that at the end of the day, this regulation will be really capable to enforce competition in the market. So when I see, this, I agree with Giuliano Amato, there's a strong revival of antitrust law. For example, the killer acquisition regulation as well is very going in the same direction. But how this will be effective, we have to see. So maybe once in Europe we're trying to reduce the power of the big tech, at the end of the day we might not be able to do so. This is on big tech regulation and antitrust regulation. On industrial policy, it is true we have this revival of industrial policy. Now we call it strategic autonomy, but at the end of the day is the old import substitution policy, if you think about it. And we see that European Union is actually, establish targets, very ambitious targets. They look like sort of Gosplan targets. No, we have to achieve 40% capacity, production capacity in whatever, photovoltaic panels, electrolyzers, heating systems, and whatever. But at the end of the day, the tools to achieve such targets remain very much in the hands of member states. And the only tool is the relaxation of state aid. So this is something unique. There is no central investment to finance even common European project, what is called the IPCI nowadays, are fully financed by member states' money. There is no one single penny which is put by the European Commission. So the fragility of the EU industrial policy is exactly like that we might need, because the world has changed, and we probably need some import substitution policy. But we can't achieve such policy target, by letting member states doing what they want. Because at the end of the day, we won't have a proper EU industrial policy. We won't achieve the targets. And we just simply have a huge fragmentation with possibly anti-competitive drawbacks. But this is the issue, is about unrealistic targets created with very poor tools. And as long as we don't have a sort of minimal fiscal central capacity in the EU, it's going to take this kind of path and this kind of problems. Just one comment on golden power, because this is a very crucial issue, and is, in my opinion, one of the most worrisome issues which we have to confront with. Because once again, we have an EU regulation, but national application. with a huge amount of administrative discretion in its application. I just want to remind you that all these prescriptions that Giuliano Amato was saying are, enacted through administrative orders, which in many occasions are against the free movement of capital, the free establishment of firms, the statutory autonomy of firms. And this is really, really something which blows my mind because it's scaring. It's very much scaring. So these are my points, that at the end of the day, we might have, the big private powers not affected by antitrust new regulation, and the big power of states being effective in achieving autonomy strategic. Thank you very much.
Okay.
My only final comment is, because I accept for you, the word is disorderly, the more there is work for practicing lawyers. So be happy and don't care.
Okay, I thank you very much. It has been a very high-level conversation, but then it went also on details. So I think it is important because, after all, our profession, and I say as a professional, but I could say also as a previous enforcer, is not only discussing cases and theories and so on, but these have impact on markets, economies, enterprises, subjects. And we must be aware of this. And so, on this point, on a final point on on the administrative character of decisions of golden power, because related also to the external decision, because in cases of opposition to these administrative decisions, the administrative judges showed an extremely self-respect, self-restraint, saying, well, these are high-level decisions of political. And that's why I think the XELA is important, because it teaches and imposes the judge to abandon its self-restraint and get into the coherence of the decision with the general system of the European freedom system, guaranteeing freedom of enterprise, freedom of competition, and so on. So from this point of view, despite 2-1, I still be a little bit optimistic. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Oh. Coffee break. Okay, that's also always. Excellent.